Hi friends, I'm making a little video series on my sourdough recipe that I've been using for a couple of years. It's been fairly consistent as long as your starter is pretty happy and healthy. It comes out pretty good. I use all-purpose flour. Usually in this, you can use bread flour, get a little nicer bready texture, but the all-purpose is fine. So I'm starting out with 240 grams of starter. This was mixed up about 12 hours ago, 1 to 1 to 1, with 80 grams of starter, 80 grams of flour, and 80 grams of water. I usually do 2 loaves at a time because it's a lot of work and it's nice to make 2 loaves at a time. So the first thing, you want to make sure your starter is pretty happy and healthy, foamy. Hopefully it's doubled in volume. Since you mix it up, you can see we have a lot of nice air bubbles in here. And actually, one thing you can do to make sure it's ready is called a flow test. I'm going to get a little water. If we just spoon a little bit of the starter out, it should float right on top of our water. So if your starter sinks to the bottom of your water, it's probably not happy enough to do very well with the recipe. So the first thing we're going to do is combine our dough ingredients. So I'm going to do 200 grams of the starter,
What are you doing now?
So this is just the second batch. So I'm doing 2 batches at once, 2 separate bowls for the separate loaves of bread. This is also a good time to feed my starter again. Since I'm not going to be making more bread for a little bit, I'm just going to feed my starter in this little pickle jar. And I always, when I feed my starter or make some starter for a loaf of bread, I always do 1 to 1 to 1. So hopefully we can get about 30 grams of starter out of the bottom of these jars. So now I'm going to start with this one and add 30 grams of all-purpose flour to it. I'll just go ahead and finish this one off with 30 grams of lukewarm water. This one I'll just go ahead and mix up. So this is mixed up right. It should have the consistency of kind of a thick pancake batter-ish. So I'm just going to lid this up loosely. It is going to produce some gas, so you want to leave that lid kind of loose so you don't build up pressure in your jar. And that's going to go back on the shelf and be my starter going forward. So back to our dough. I'm now going to add 600 grams of flour to each one.
So pretty nice to have a scale.
Yeah, and it's much more accurate to measure flour by weight than by volume. There's 600 in this one. A little more.
Flour from Costco.
Just gonna go ahead and fill up my countertop flour. Okay, so we have 200 grams of starter, 600 grams of flour in each little mixing bowl. Now we're going to add 400 grams of lukewarm water to each of these. And 400 grams is going to be somewhere around 2 cups. 400 grams of water to the second one. I'm just going to move my scale out of the way for a minute, because now comes a super messy part. Mix each of these up by hands somewhat thoroughly. You don't need to get too overboard with it. We're going to be working with it a little bit more later. Just want to try to get all of this flour wet. Some little lumps are okay though. So we have these all mixed up now. I went ahead and washed all the gunk off my hands. This gets pretty messy. We're gonna cover these lightly with some plastic wrap and let them rest for about half an hour to really let that flour hydrate, let the the moisture kind of distribute pretty evenly throughout the flour. And then we'll be back for some more. These have been resting for about 30 minutes. Now I'm going to add 12 grams of salt to each one, a small splash of water, just to kind of get that salt dissolved. The salt is really the only flavoring that goes in here, so don't skimp on it.
It's like 13 grams of salt.
Yeah, 12 to 15 is fine. Then I'm going to throw in just a splash of water, somewhere 1/8 of a cup to like a 1/4 cup. Just right on top of that salt. Just a little bit. I'm going to leave the plastic wrap on this one for a minute, because I'm going to be working with this batch first. Cover this one up again.
Bam.
Tiny kitchen is so much fun. So now I'm going to knead each of these for 8 minutes, a full 8 minutes on each one. There's a few different techniques for kneading out there that people do in their videos. The one I've become partial to and use for this is a slap and fold, which I'll kind of demonstrate here in a minute. I'm going to set up a timer for a full 8 minutes, just to make sure we get nice and fully kneaded. And over here I have 2 of my bowls set out that I'm going to be resting these in for the first like room temperature proofing after the knead. So I'm going to mix this up a little bit by hand in the bowl before I get it out on the counter. Get some of that water worked in there. And this is a pretty like sticky, sloppy dough. So it can be a little bit tricky to work with it sometimes without just getting it like all over everything. But all that water in the dough is going to give us a nice amount of moisture for that airy oven rise when we bake it tomorrow. So I've got the water worked in there. So I'm going to just pull this out on an unfloured counter. So I'm going to take this, slap it against the counter, kind of pull it this way, and fold it back over. And then the next time I'm going to pick it up from the edge and slap it the other direction and fold it back over. So I'm going to just keep doing that for the full 8 minutes.
When he grabs it from the side, you see how he brings it back at a 90-degree angle towards himself.
As the 8 minutes go along, you'll feel the texture kind of change. At first it's like very watery and sticky and not very stretchy. It's a little bit brittle. As it gets more kneaded, it'll get a little more elastic and a little stretchier.
Anything else you want to add?
I don't think so. Basically, once this 8 minutes is up of kneading, I'm going to throw it in these containers over here I have prepared. Cover them loosely, and they're going to proof at room temperature for about 4 hours.
What do you cover them with?
These have nice tight-fitting lids. You don't actually want to have them like sealed. So they have a little bit of room for air to escape as carbon dioxide forms while it's proofing. You just want them covered loosely to make sure, try to keep most of the moisture in and keep all the bugs and dust out of them. You could also use a kitchen towel or plastic wrap. Just want to kind of keep it covered. So it's about 4.5 hours after we set the dough out on the counter to do a little room temperature rise proof. And it is looking poofed. Look at this. It's about doubled in size. We have some nice bubbles forming on top there. So now we're going to start forming this into an actual loaf of bread. So the first step is going to be sprinkling a clean countertop with a little bit of flour. And there's so much water in this dough that it's hard to accidentally get too much extra flour into it. And it's pretty sticky and can be a little bit tough to handle. So we'll kind of talk about that in a minute. And just get a nice coating of flour on my counter. So to get the dough out of these stainless steel bowls is a little tricky because the dough's so sticky. So what I always do, I just use a little silicone spatula to kind of scrape it out and kind of get in here. Just kind of get it out as much as you can. Kind of let it pour onto the counter. big, sticky blob of dough. So now our first step, now I'm going to sprinkle some flour around basically the edges here, because that's where I'm going to have to touch it. And while you're shaping the loaves, you kind of want to remember like which side of it is going to be the top of the dough. So right now, the bottom side against the counter is going to eventually be the top of my loaf. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull the edges of this towards the center and then flip it over. So when you touch the dough, you want to use like kind of quick, confident touches. If you like touch the dough for too long, it really starts to stick to your hands pretty badly. So we're just going to pull the edges towards the center. Then I'm going to flip it over. So you might want to dust this a little bit more on this side before I flip it over. Now I'm going to bring my hands together and kind of make it into a little ball here. So that's pretty nice for now. I'm going to stick a little bit more flour on top here because we're going to cover this with plastic wrap and let it rest for another 30 minutes before we touch it again. This is our last step before we put it in the fridge overnight. We're going to finish it tomorrow in the oven. Just a little more work to make this into a little more of a loaf. Before we stick it in these bowls. So these are the same two bowls I was mixing the dough up in earlier. You want something that's like kind of deep and like somewhat skinny. Hopefully a similar like diameter to your Dutch oven that you'll bake it in tomorrow. And then I'm going to line these with some old pillowcases. You know, different people recommend different kind of, you know, kitchen towels or cloths or washcloths. These pillowcases seem to work pretty well. They don't have as much of a problem of the dough actually sticking to the cloth. I ran into that a little bit more trying to use like kitchen hand towels. So I'm just going to go ahead and line these.
Who's a cutie?
So once I have these lined with my pillowcases, I'm going to actually sprinkle the pillowcase with flour as well, just to reduce the chance of any of the dough sticking to the cloth. All right, now
Just did like a nice even layer.
yeah, you don't need to go too heavy, but you want to get enough to prevent any sticking. I'm going to take my dough, and since we flipped this at the end of the last like kind of loafing session, the top now, what's like facing me, is what I want to be the top of the loaf. So I'm going to sprinkle that pretty nicely with flour. Now this is a little bit of a tricky part. I need to flip this whole thing upside down onto the counter. Now this tool is pretty handy for a few steps in this process, namely this step, and then also like cleaning any dried up dough off of your counter. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of like make sure this is loose and not like too stuck to the counter. So I'm going to try to just kind of get under there like that.
Tucking it in.
Okay, I think I can try to give it a flip now. This is going to be a little tough, tricky, but just go for it. There. So now we have the bottom side. I'm going to fold the top, or the part away from me, halfway to the middle. I'm going to fold the left side to the right side to the left, and finally the bottom to the top. Roll it over, kind of form it into a ball a little bit more. And if it starts kind of sticking to my hand, I'm just going to sprinkle a little more flour around to keep it from sticking. And kind of get some on your hand too. You can even use this guy to kind of like do that a little bit, and that helps seal up the bottom. Basically, once I have this into a nice little ball like I want it, make sure I have a little more flour on here, a little more flour on my hands. I'm going to flip it over this side down in my bowl. So now with the bottom of this, you have some little cracks. I try to just like pinch those up a little bit. It's all going to rest in the fridge overnight, so that'll kind of seal up and all form together nicely. Then I'm going to sprinkle a little more flour on the bottom of my loaf here. Just again to keep that cloth from sticking to it. Now I'm going to fold the cloth over. And that's going to rest in the fridge overnight until we go to bake it tomorrow. Day 2 of sourdough recipe. So these have been in the fridge overnight, at least like 12 hours. Nice and puffy. So I'm going to cover that. A nice sized piece of parchment paper. Now on top of parchment paper, take a cutting board. Then, about 40 minutes ago, I put the Dutch oven in the oven and basically turned my oven up as high as it'll go. My recipe says like 480, so basically as high as your oven will go for the start of baking. And then you want to preheat the Dutch oven in the hot oven for at least like 40-45 minutes. So now we're going to flip this over. Gently. And pull our pillowcase off. So now I'm going to lift this by the corners, try to keep it like on the, just lift it by the parchment paper and drop it down into the preheated Dutch oven. Then you want to take, I use a utility razor blade. You can use a nice sharp small kitchen knife, or there are some like specialty tools for this. I find the razor blade works pretty well for it. Just give it a couple of slices across the top of the loaf. You don't need to go too deep, you just want to make a little slice in the top. Then we're going to throw in a splash of water, just like 1/8 of a cup or so. And this is going to steam up when we throw it in the oven and give us that nice chewy crust. Put our lid back on. Our oven mitts are dying, so I'm starting to burn myself.
Oh no!
So you want to leave that at about 500 degrees and set a timer for 25 minutes. We've had the dough, or the loaf at this point, in the oven for 25 minutes at 500 degrees. Now we're going to pull the lid of the Dutch oven off, turn it down to 450, and bake it for another 25 minutes to brown the top of the crust. Take a look and see what it looks like now. Down to 450 and another 25 minutes and we should be done. So we finished our baking, another 25 minutes at 450. We're ready to pull it out and see how the top is browning. Oh yes. Loaf. So I'm going to pull this out of here and actually let it dry on this rack that's under the Dutch oven right now. I usually let it cool down with the parchment paper on it for about half an hour, and then carefully pull the parchment paper off, let it cool all the way down. Before you cut into it, I know it's really tempting to cut into the loaf before it's done cooling down. It's not a good plan. So I hope you enjoyed the video and good luck.
When can they cut into it?
Once it's completely cool.
Which usually takes...
It usually takes like 3 or 4 hours to be completely cooled down.
Cool.